Imagine losing your home, having almost no money, being separated from the person you love, and still waking up every morning with one goal: to build a better life for your child. This is the incredible story of Chris Gardner, a man who went through some of the darkest moments of his life and still refused to give up. His story teaches us something powerful. Sometimes happiness is not about having everything. Sometimes happiness is simply knowing you didn't give up. In 1981, Chris Gardner was living in San Francisco with his wife Linda and their young son Christopher. Chris had invested all his money into an expensive medical device called a bone density scanner. He believed hospitals would buy it easily, but there was one major problem. The scanner was extremely expensive. It cost almost twice as much as an X-ray machine. And because hospitals already had X-ray machines, convincing them to buy his scanner was almost impossible. Chris needed to sell at least 2 scanners every month just to survive. But month after month, he struggled to sell even one. The rent was already 2 months overdue, bills were piling up, and Linda had started working double shifts just to keep the family going. She was exhausted, and slowly, she began losing faith in Chris. Their arguments became more frequent. Linda started believing that Chris was simply wasting his life and that marrying him had been a mistake. But Chris still refused to give up. Every morning, he dropped Christopher at school, then went out searching for hospitals that might buy his scanner. But almost every day, he came home empty-handed. One day, things became even worse. Chris received a notice about unpaid taxes, and when he went outside, his car was towed away for illegal parking. Now, he had almost nothing left. That night, Chris sat at home and started solving a Rubik's Cube. At the time, the puzzle was relatively new, and surprisingly, Chris was very good at solving it. Then something happened that would change his life. The next day, Chris saw a man driving an expensive car. He asked him, "What do you do for a living?" The man pointed toward a large building. He told Chris that he was a stockbroker. Chris looked at the people coming out of the building. They looked successful. They looked happy. And Chris thought, maybe this is my way out. He decided he wanted to become a stockbroker. But when he told Linda, she laughed at him. After all, Chris had no college degree. He had no experience in the stock market, and he barely had enough money to survive. But Chris didn't change his mind. The next day, he went to a stock brokerage company to apply for a job. He left his scanner with a street artist and went inside. An employee began explaining the application process, but suddenly Chris looked outside. The street artist was running away with his scanner. Chris immediately ran after him, but the man jumped onto a train and disappeared. He had lost another opportunity, but he didn't give up. The following day, he returned to the company and submitted his application, and then he finally got an interview. Around the same time, Chris met a man named Jay. Chris wanted to impress him, so when Jay was solving a Rubik's Cube, Chris took the puzzle and solved it. Jay was amazed. Chris had just demonstrated something important. He could learn difficult things quickly. But Chris's personal life was falling apart. Linda had reached her limit. She eventually decided to leave, but Christopher stayed with his father. Chris loved his son more than anything. He couldn't imagine living without him. So now, Chris had 2 responsibilities. He had to build a career and raise his little boy. Then came the interview, and Chris arrived wearing terrible clothes. Why? Because he had just spent time in police custody over an unpaid parking ticket. The interviewers were shocked. Chris honestly explained what had happened. Everyone laughed, but Chris didn't panic. They asked about his education. He explained that he had finished first in his class, but there had only been 12 students. Then the company head, Mr. Martin, asked him a difficult question. If a man walked into this office without a shirt, why would you hire him? Chris thought for a moment, then answered, maybe he had on a really nice pair of pants. Everyone laughed, but this time they weren't laughing at him. They liked his confidence, his honesty, and his ability to think under pressure. Chris got selected, but there was a catch. He'd have to train for 6 months, and during that entire period, he wouldn't receive a salary. That night, Linda told Chris she had found a job in New York. She wanted to leave, but Chris decided to keep Christopher with him. Linda walked away crying, and Chris took his son and moved into a cheap hotel. For the first time, Chris and Christopher were completely on their own. One day, Christopher told his father that he wanted to become a basketball player, but Chris accidentally told him, "You're probably not going to be very good at basketball." Christopher became sad. Chris immediately realized his mistake. He looked at his son and said, "Don't ever let somebody tell you that you can't do something." Then he added, "Not even me." And those words became one of the most important lessons of Christopher's life. Chris began his training. There were many candidates, but only one person would eventually get the job, and Chris was already behind. He didn't have a prestigious education, he didn't understand the stock market, and he had no financial safety net. While everyone else was competing for success, Chris was also fighting simply to survive. He worked longer hours, he made more phone calls, he skipped meals. He even avoided drinking water because he didn't want to waste time going to the bathroom. His colleagues had 9 hours to finish their work. Chris tried to finish the same amount in 6. And after work, he still had to pick Christopher up from school. Then, somehow, he had to find a place for them to sleep. 2 months passed, but Chris still hadn't achieved any major success. Then, one day, his biggest potential client called. He told Chris to meet him within 20 minutes. Chris rushed there. He was desperate to close the deal, but everything seemed to work against him. Eventually, he met the client. He apologized for being late and thanked him for giving him an opportunity. The client invited Chris and Christopher to watch a football game. During the game, the man told Chris, "I'm impressed with you." But then he added, "That doesn't mean I'm going to invest in your company." Chris was disappointed, but he didn't show it. Instead, he watched his son enjoying the football game. For a few moments, Christopher was simply happy, and that was enough for Chris. But then, another disaster arrived. Chris received an income tax notice. The government took the remaining money from his bank account, money that Chris desperately needed. He went to a friend and asked him for money he had previously lent him, but his friend refused. Chris was running out of options. Then he saw the same beggar again. The man had his scanner. Chris finally managed to get it back. He found a doctor who was interested in buying it, but there was another problem. The scanner was broken. The doctor refused to buy it. And when Chris returned to the motel, his belongings were outside. The door was locked. The motel owner had thrown him out. Chris stood there, with his son beside him, and nowhere to go. That night, Chris took Christopher to a train station. They had nowhere else to sleep. Chris tried to make the situation feel like an adventure. He told Christopher, "This isn't a scanner, it's a time machine." They pretended they had traveled back to the age of dinosaurs. Chris took his son into a restroom and pretended they were hiding from dinosaurs. Eventually, Christopher fell asleep in his father's arms. But Chris couldn't sleep. He sat there, helpless, exhausted, broken. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had completely failed, and he began to cry. But the next morning, he got up because his son was still depending on him. Chris eventually found a church that provided shelter, but there were hundreds of people waiting. The space was limited, so if you arrived too late, you were turned away. Chris now had another challenge. He had to finish his work, pick up Christopher, and reach the church early enough to get a place to sleep. Every single day, he was racing against time and against poverty. His scanner was still broken. He didn't have enough money to buy the replacement part. He barely had enough money for food. And yet, he continued working. Finally, the day of the final exam arrived. Chris took the test, but he had no idea whether he would get the job. After the exam, he met Mr. Martin. Martin had forgotten his wallet and needed $5 for a taxi. Chris had almost no money, but he still gave him the $5. That night, there was no space left at the church, so Chris and Christopher slept on a train. Chris had nowhere else to go, but he still refused to give up. To raise money, Chris even sold his blood. With the money, he bought the replacement part for the scanner. He repaired it, then he finally sold the scanner. For the first time in a long time, Chris had enough money to stay in a hotel. That night, he and Christopher could sleep peacefully. The next morning, Chris took his son to the beach. For a few moments, there were no bills, no phone calls, no pressure, no fear, just a father and his son. But Chris knew something important. That day, he would find out whether he had been selected. Chris arrived at the office. Mr. Martin noticed his new shirt. Chris explained that it was the final day of his internship, so he wanted to dress properly. Then, Mr. Martin smiled and said something Chris would never forget. "Wear this shirt tomorrow, too." Chris looked confused. Then, Martin continued, "Tomorrow is your first day on the job." Chris couldn't believe it. After months of struggle, after homelessness, after hunger, after humiliation, after sleepless nights, he had finally made it. He had gotten the job. Mr. Martin asked him, "Was it easy?" Chris smiled and said, "No." Then he paused. It wasn't easy at all. Mr. Martin even returned the $5 Chris had lent him. Chris walked away, overwhelmed with emotion. And he realized something. This feeling, this was happiness. Chris had survived the impossible, and this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The man who once had nowhere to sleep would eventually become a successful businessman. He would build a multi-million-dollar company and become an inspiration to millions of people around the world. And perhaps the greatest lesson from his story is this: running away from difficulties is easy, but every difficult moment is a test. Those who give up may escape the struggle, but those who keep fighting can change their entire destiny. So, if you're going through a difficult time right now, remember Chris Gardner, remember his journey, and remember these words: never let anyone tell you that you can't achieve your dreams, not even yourself. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were in Chris Gardner's situation?